Hi, my name is Andy Kirk, and welcome to Season 1 of Explore Explain. This is a podcast and video series all about data visualization design. In each episode, I have conversations with designers and developers to explore in depth the hidden thinking behind their visualization projects. I'll be asking them to explain the what, the why, and the how of their design process. We have some great guests, some wonderful projects to learn about, so let's jump straight into today's episode. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Explore Explain. This is a very special episode. We have two guests today. I'm delighted to welcome Sebastian and Sabine. Sebastian, to begin with, can you introduce yourself? Who you are, where you work, please?
Yes, my name is Sebastian Vollenhals. I'm a hacker and a data journalist, and at the moment I'm working with Funke Interaktiv, who does data visualizations for a number of local newspapers, amongst them the Berliner Morgenpost.
Super. And Sabine, hello to you as well. Can you introduce yourself to people listening and watching out there?
Hi, my name is Sabina, and I'm a journalist and a data storyteller, and I work at polypoly.gmbh, which is a startup concerned with data privacy, as the director of research.
Well, you're both very welcome. Thank you for giving up your time today. So we're going to look at a project you both worked on called HeatScore, which was published in November of last year. To begin with, I'll come to you first of all, Sebastian. Can you just give a brief outline for those who can't see this project right now because they're listening? Just a brief summary of what this project is, what it's about.
That's a tough question because there's plenty of things to say. It's basically there was a data collection leaked on the internet of passwords that were obtained from several websites, from hacks, from data breaches, whatever. We obtained these passwords and did a lot of data wrangling on them, and then tried to show what's in there, what passwords are actually made of, what strategies people use in passwords, what statistics they show, and trying to give some advice about how to use passwords, how to create passwords, and what things to avoid.
That's interesting. So it's not just that you are looking at the way that people use passwords, but in a sense using that to shape advice for how people should improve passwords, which I guess is the other aspect of this. So we begin with the backstory of this project. You talked about the fact it's from a hacked data collection. How did you come about working on this project? What was the starting point? What triggered this work in the first place?
I was always curious about passwords. I mean, speaking as passwords as data, it's a very interesting subject. Usually you don't get a lot of passwords from people. I mean, they're supposed to be a secret and not be public on the internet. So this was really an opportunity to have a look into the thing. I heard about this vast collection, the biggest yet password collection that is somewhere on the underground internet right now. And then, of course, I had to take a look at it, and I thought it would be interesting to do some data analysis with it.
So the curiosity was clearly there, something that you were kind of keen to work on. How did this sort of build up into an actual project itself? Who was the client effectively? Who were the people sort of paying you or commission you to sort of take this forward into an actual project development?
Well, in the very beginning, it was just me and my curiosity, and I looked into it, and it was sort of I just do it because I'm curious myself, and I'm my own client in that regard. But me and Sabine at the time worked at the Infographics Group, and of course we were obligated to produce stories for the data story platform they were developing. And this would make a perfect fit for this platform. And so I talked to Sabine, and she was like, yeah, this could be a nice story. And so I kept on digging and kept on finding out stuff and trying to make sense of all of this. And it developed into a story together with Sabine and together with Kwame Charles, our brilliant designer, and together with Daniela, who is doing all the making it nice and working on the platform. So it became a really interesting project.
So, going to you, Sabina, Sebastian spoke about the people involved there, some of the kind of colleagues that you worked with. when it comes to a piece like this, are there any other external parties with whom you need to consult? Subject matter experts, people out there who will help you to know that what you're analysing, what you're coming up with is legitimate, is robust? Any other parties involved from your sort of production side of this project?
We were probably, at the infographics group, we were a pretty well-stocked team in terms of that. We had researchers, we had designers, we had data journalists, we had data analysts, and some people who had multiple hats that could kind of take on that role. So it was a really unique and interesting opportunity for all of us who were working on that product to kind of create something like that. So we did have to talk to Jan Schwachow, who was the founder of the company and also still the editor-in-chief of that product. And he, I think, also, I believe, consulted with a lawyer in this terms, because this was technically an illegal data set that we were working with. And we wanted to make sure that we were going to be protected, even as a private company who works as a journalistic product. We do have some journalistic rights, but it could also be considered a gray zone in some ways. So, yeah, we did have to look into the legal aspect of this.
Yeah, I think that's something that was striking about the topic, and obviously the origins of the data source. Just in a nutshell, did you have to take any steps to ensure that this stayed on the right side of the legalities, or was that quite clear-cut what that would involve?
Yes. One of the things I did, I wasn't interested in the actual login credentials, so usually you have a username or password. I completely cut out the username wherever I could. This was one of the steps we undertook. I was only interested in the passwords and the statistics and not which site they are for, not really which country they originate from. And later on, you will see in the project, we did a password search where you can type in your password and you see how many other instances of this password is alive. Since a lot of people were using email addresses as passwords, or could be in some instances also faulty data, but a lot of email addresses were popping up in the passwords. I tried to filter out as many of those as possible. Also stuff like websites or IP addresses and such like, so that they're not really in the data. It's a very small percentage, but I felt that if we publish passwords in RAW, then this should be a thing that could be omitted. And
That's
they're not
right.
that interesting, to be fair.
Yeah, it was really important that we had no identifiable, no way to identify who those passwords were coming from and where they were coming from.
Yes, it's still some of the passwords are inherently identifiable for some reason that is beyond what we can do about it. But we did our best to keep the privacy of those affected as much as possible.
That's right, and as we'll talk about in a short while, the analysis is very much pitched at quite an aggregated level to look at themes rather than specific examples too much. Just on the same theme of people, what would be the process with which you would characterise the audience for this kind of work? So obviously this is something that's in a large part your own curiosity, Sebastian, and in a sense on the first level it's for you.
Yes.
But how would you characterise the audience intended to be the recipients of this, and how does that contrast with the usual audiences that the infographics group would normally expect to attract to their site?
Yeah, I really try to build a bridge there between people who understand the subject matter, like security researchers or people who are responsible for large networks and have to implement password policies every day. But also, let's be fair, everyone uses password in some way. So it's the general public that's really interested. I could say, yeah, it's for people who use passwords, but in the end of the day, that's everyone. So I tried to make it so that security researchers would say, yeah, this is legit. This is what we would also say, but also make it understandable and graspable by the general public who is not so deep into the matter than we are.
Can I just ask about language usage? So obviously the project that we're looking at today is in English.
Yes.
Do you always pitch your work around English language audiences? Would you have considered other language versions of this piece? And did the passwords that were emerging almost necessitate the need to think about some other languages for the different audiences around the world?
So I think, our publication is in English, so it was really that kind of thing. But I believe, Sebastian can correct me here, but the data, like the password information was coming from all over the place, like obviously North America. I know Russia was a huge source, or like at least Cyrillic lettered languages. And all of those things, which also sort of made some complications in terms of the data cleaning that Sebastian had to do. I learned a lot about Mojibakes, right? And so I think for us, it was really like our publication is in English. The biggest reachable audience is in English. Even though we're based here in Berlin, Germany, and our publication is based here in Berlin. A lot of people speak English, and it was just about reaching the widest possible audience, really.
Yes, indeed. And also we don't have people ready to translate stuff to Russian or Chinese, so that might also play a part.
Right, of course, yeah. Just think about the deliverables, and again, we'll come on to the intricate aspects of the design later on, but the deliverables, so I guess the centerpiece is a digital work, and this is one of the most successful pieces I've ever encountered in terms of how well it works on mobile. In fact, I almost feel the mobile version is the centerpiece version. Was this also something that you would seek to publish in print?
We actually have adapted this. So the Infographics Group is publishing a book of all of their InGraphics magazine articles, and have also adapted the digital first stories into that print. So it will be sort of featured in this book that's coming out at the end of this year as a 2-page spread in like a large format book.
Yeah, my vision when I started to think about the visualizations of the data was very transmedia. So of course it makes sense to publish it digital because it's digital data in the end, but you could do a lot more. One of the ideas I was pitching, and I'm still a little sad it didn't catch on, was to print all, in the office building, there was another company, Exatapete. They print stuff on wallpapers, and why not print all the passwords on wallpapers, plaster a wall with all the passwords, and you could do this in some sort of museum or big hall, plaster the whole wall with it in very fine print, and then just put in the center of the room a terminal where you could type a password and a laser would point to the password on the wall. That would be a brilliant way to visualize the data. It would put people in awe and say this is like every password in air quotes, but it would amaze people what they would type would show up on the wall precisely. So this is still an idea. I'm a bit sad that will probably never come to fruition, but I was thinking about how to make this go into the real world, go into the physically experienceable world.
Well, let's put that as a work in progress for now. Let's not rule that
Let's
out.
hope so.
Sounds cool. Sorry,
I did tell Chris Wins, the new CEO of the Infographics Group, about it, and he was like really into the idea in terms of like a temporary exhibition for like a conference or something. So there's still hope.
Absolutely. Again, on the side of the sort of process side of things, what were the timescales involved in this? Now, obviously, when it's a slightly self-initiated piece, in a sense, you are the master of your own timescales, but I guess at some point you have to say, we've got to finish this, we've got to stop this. What were the timescales involved, and how did you collectively kind of manage your time and your involvement in the project?
There were 2 phases really. One was the data wrangling phase, which was very vast, and then there was the let's make a visualization out of it phase, which was a bit more to the point. So the data wrangling took on 2.5 to 3 months, basically. Just the time to go over the data and do some operation on it could be 2 or 3 days at a time, which is hilarious when you think about it. I mean, I was going to the data naive. Yeah, it's a very big archive, and it has more archives in it, and it has text files, and all of those text files are in the gigabytes. How hard can it be? And it turns out if you if you don't optimize your programming and try to accommodate the circumstances. I mean, it's big data in the best sense we're talking about here, and it's not clean big data, it's dirty big data. And it's really tough to handle all this. And I was like, yeah, maybe I can do it in 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know, but it turns out to take a lot longer. And then in the end, when I was like, now I'm in a state where I'm happy to actually do something with the data, to actually do visualizations, and then Sabine came to the rescue and organized the organized the part where we visualized the data and made it into a thing people could look at, because my vast ASCII text files weren't really cutting it.
They were really impressive, though.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to yourself, Sabina, I mean, I guess at the time you were working together in the same office space, but how does a teamwork environment operate in those circumstances when different people are in effect coming at different stages of the process? How do you kind of optimize that collaboration?
I mean, communication is really the most important part of it. And I think also sort of having clearly defined roles in terms of like who's answerable, who's responsible, who has the hat, who's making the decisions, and just having those really clear reporting lines is kind of like what also made this really successful. I think the fact that Sebastian took the initiative in the beginning to just kind of like go through it himself instead of like bringing everybody on board in the beginning, sort of actually made things helpful, because he was kind of it just sort of made it a one-man show for the longer part of the thing, which obviously kept like the project a little more lean than it could have been if we'd sort of brought everyone on from the beginning. We also did it that like it was sort of a sort of in phases, where Sebastian started, he came to me with it, and then we would sort of start talking about various angles, and it would also be like, okay, well, what if we explored this aspect of it? Or can we find, like, one of the things that we looked for was, can we discover baby name trends by looking for name and year in the passwords? And it would just be like, and so it was probably like 4 weeks of this kind of going back and forth in like, because it took so long to sort of do the research and the analysis as well. But by the time we brought in Kwame Charles and Daniela Schaffenberg and everybody else, we had pretty much already set the storyboard. We had pretty much already like decided on the heat map visualization. We had kind of like sort of distilled it down to these very basic elements that made it easier for us to sort of get into it and sort of streamline the process.
I just wondered as well if there's another aspect to the pressures. We spoke about some of the legal pressures, but if this has been, as a data set, shared with the world, was there a sense that you had to almost race to market with your work because others surely are also doing something similar? Did you feel that as a pressure, or did you just feel that we just need to concentrate on our own progress and what will be will be?
I mean, we focused very much on our own process, and I think we also felt fairly confident that no one was going to sort of invest the time that we had invested in this data set either. We had there had already been reporting and analysis done out of this data set by Wired, by the Institute in Potsdam, but I can't remember the name. Sebastian?
Der MIZ Babelsberg,
Yeah.
the Medieninnovationszentrum.
Yeah, so there's been like there had already been information about it out there. But no one had really kind of but it had already kind of felt like a forgotten story. We actually also finished the story end of May, June, basically, and then kind of just sat on it for the right opportunity. And there was some sort of discussion about like when it should be published, if we should wait for the summer, or should like wait for this, like do it in the sort of the summer media slump, or kind of try and get into it afterwards. And so there really was no rush to kind of come up with the story in the end. And then, as I was ready to go preparing a presentation to go speak at the big conference in Oslo, they had said, okay, let's publish this thing finally. And I was like, oh God, yes, finally. Yeah.
Just to kind of cover off last couple of points about constraints, were there any design constraints or guidelines that you have to accommodate in terms of the broader infographics group, or is it something that you've got effectively a blank canvas to do what you wish in terms of style, look and feel, colours?
We do have, so we had some constraints in that, like we have like a font, a typography that we have to use, and in terms of colors and styles, we were able to be pretty like open. We also had a software constraint in that the infographics group page, info.graphics, is not built on code, but built in using an internally developed software that is like a web-based, WebGL like kind of thing that, yeah, that's sort of this monster hybrid, cool little thing that they did. So obviously it had to sort of be something, and it's not a perfect solution, but it's pretty cool and it's pretty neat, and it makes it very accessible for graphic designers to sort of create these kind of scrolly telling stories. But it did mean that sort of in some of the effects that we had in there, we had to kind of come up with hacks and like workarounds to sort of create like this sort of the revealing process. Like when you, on the title page, when you scroll up, is the title reveals itself through various dots. And so those are kind of like little things where we had to think about in layers and hacks instead of being able to just kind of code it to be the way that we want it to be.
Yeah. Last couple of points relate to yourself, Sebastian, when you first had this curiosity about this potential analysis. Before you even got into the data, did you have in your mind's eye any ideas about what this thing might even look like? Because obviously at the end we've got a piece that's quite it's an explanatory piece. You know, you are walking people through different steps of analysis to tell them something, and then at the end, as we'll come on to later, there's a chance to interact with it. But did you have any different wild ideas of what this would look like that it doesn't look like now?
I had a good idea about what the data would be like, but I was really underestimating it. In terms of visualizations, sure, I had like, yeah, just let's throw all the password into some password strength checker and use this, or see what the character sets are, or see if we can find passwords that contain emoji. Stuff like that, stuff that's like, yeah, just curiosity.
Right.
But I don't think in the beginning I had all the ideas. I mean, the best ideas develop either from drinking a beer with a colleague or from staring at data. So I had to stare at the data first.
To earn the right to drink with a colleague, of course, yeah.
Yes, of course.
And the last question is, have you seen anything out there, any other works that relate to this kind of topic, word usage, password usage, that you could have sought inspiration from, that you might look to emulate or even look to avoid, because that's been done, we need to do something very different?
Yes, I mean, security researchers are always interested in statistics about password. Not only like the people who try to protect stuff, but also the people who try to break stuff. I mean, if you try to crack password, it makes sense to first get an idea of what passwords are made of, get the statistics. So you try the more likely passwords first, so you get to a result earlier. And this is between people who try to break into stuff and security researchers who actually make a sport out of it. So we have this file, and let's see how many percent of those hashes we can crack with our rule sets and with our ideas about passwords. So of course I had to look into this. Then there's security researchers. I mean, Troy Hunt, for example, who makes this wonderful Have I Been Pwned website. He works with data sets like this all the time. He takes a very different approach on how to handle the data, but still it's really interesting to look at. And yeah, I mean, it's not some sort of data no one has ever tried visualization or making sense of in the broadest sense. So of course I could draw from previous work.
So moving on to look at the more kind of data side, the analytical side, the editorial side. You've talked about the sheer magnitude of this data set and some of the steps that you took to strip away some of the perhaps more identifiable information potentially. Can you just give a quick run through about some of the headline quantities? So obviously we see the headline on the opening screen, which is 720 million hacked unique passwords. I mean, what were some of the interesting observations that you initially made about the data set you were working with? I'm thinking the length of passwords, longest to shortest. What were some of the headline observations when you examined the data initially?
That there was were really no limits. I mean, I had like I mean the wrangling was really hard. There's not only like valid passwords in there. There's a lot of garbage data. There's a lot of, I mean, it's like a Matryoshka archive with archives in it, and a lot of the data is redundant and doubled up, and sometimes just in different encodings. So I had to deduplify on the file basis. I try to DWFI on a credential basis. There's a ton of different formats. I mean, simple stuff like what sort of line break people use, or what sort of encoding they use, or what they use as a separation character. There was so much data wrangling going on. It was, and I mean, at some point you can't really decide if like 1024 character line is containing a password or it's just garbage data, and at some point you cannot really say what is the longest password. I mean, that's the obvious question: what is the best or the longest password? What is the most common one? The most common one is pretty easy to answer. What is the longest one isn't really answerable, because at some point you cannot decide what is garbage and what is actual data. Same goes for the very short passwords. You have stuff with single character passwords, and I doubt that like the letter A is a very popular password, because most sites wouldn't allow it. So I think we can be fair and just filter it out. Then I had to deal with all sorts of hashes, because every sensible programmer is not saving plain text passwords. So they're saving it in a cryptographic hash, and then it's just a long string of garbage characters. And when it's like, yeah, this is like 64 hex characters, then it's pretty obviously a string. But what about some password algorithms produce like eight character strings, and then you cannot decide, is it a good password or is it just the decrypt function used on a very bad password? So you have to take all the findings with a spoon of salt, not just a grain. And there was, I mean, I have like several text files where I've written down all the stuff that was broken, and all the stuff, all the things I tried to fix, and all the things I filtered out. In the end, I ended up with roughly 10 billion usable lines of credentials, which is a lot.
Yeah, it's important to note that it's 720 million unique
Of course.
passwords.
Yes.
So
yes.
that's like 720 million unique sets in those 10 billion.
Yes, indeed. And I had to throw away like 30,000 empty passwords, 2 billion that were hashes, some that were unfixable because they were obviously garbled in a way that weren't fixable anymore.
So what you're saying
Yes.
is that in effect you had to discard billions of records, which is just
Yes.
impossible to almost process.
Yes.
And as you say, you've gone through this process, and each time you've kind of almost reacquainted yourself with the data. There's a new criteria to exclude and to include and to clean and to modify. But I guess you
Yes.
don't know that until you get into it. So, I mean, Sabina mentioned earlier on that this was, as lean a process as you could have gone through. As you look back now over that data exploration, examination process, are there things that you wish you'd have done differently, or things that you didn't have time to do that you would have liked to do? Or do you feel that what you did was the best it could be realistically?
In a finite amount of time, I think I did the best that was possible.
Good solution, good answer.
I agree.
Perfect. Team collaboration of you there. The other part of getting data is also with regards to subject research, and we'll come on to some of the annotations that exist in the commentaries we go through the project in a short while. But I was struck by some of the observations that you make about things such as the knowledge that you have about the Wheel of Fortune hint letters. How do little nuggets of knowledge like that emerge? Do you seek them out? Do you just happen to come across them and think, that will be a useful thing to drop in? How did that sort of aspect of gathering come?
So I actually knew the RSTLNE thing before. I'm like a trivia nerd, and like, so just being, and also like I am primarily a writer, and so being a writer, like, immediately when Sebastian showed me like the first draft of the heat maps was actually one of the first things that he showed me.
I think it was the eye chart, we called it.
The eye chart was the first thing that you showed me. And then there was a bar chart of like the password lengths where I was like, this is garbage. And then we looked at and then there was the heat maps, and they were just like pink at the time. And so, yeah, so I was like, the heat maps were the most compelling thing. And I mean, looking at the eye chart as well, it all felt really obvious to me where these things were coming from. Like I recognized them because they're things that I do as well in terms of like, you know, how I make my, I'm not anymore, I should say, not anymore. But yeah, sort of using these rules of grammar and like, I mean, as a writer, that's my expertise, and applying them to how we create our passwords. And that just felt like, yeah, that just felt really obvious and clear. And I could see it immediately in terms of like what I was looking at or what was happening or the human behavior behind this data set behind the data that was visualized.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. We'll come on to some of the writing aspects again later on. The next thing I want to look at is the discussion that we touched on earlier, which is the idea that you kind of came together and effectively storyboarded the contents of this work. And if we think about the contents that are included, you've basically got this kind of very sensible and insightful sequence of different topics. So we begin with things like the frequency of characters appearing in any of the passwords. We've got the length of passwords. We've got the position of capital letters. How did you decide that these were the things that would be included in the final work? How did you know that this was the set of analysis to include? And did that by extension mean that you left out things that we could have seen but just didn't find a space or a time to include them?
I think for us, or for me at least, it was really about creating a broadest possible relevance to the data set for the audience or for any audience. And I was able to sort of take some of those initial slides as well and present them at smaller talks that I was giving, and where I was able to say like, okay, I could kind of pretend that I was a psychic and say, okay, your password is capital letters, and then sort of relate it back to the data set. And even though the story wasn't published yet, you know, and I would present these and I could sort of see like fingers go up as people would start counting their passwords. I would start seeing like sort of people hiding behind their faces when I would say, oh, we put exclamation marks on the end of our passwords, and people were like, oh God. And like one guy, like one time he like literally just kind of like slid out of his chair as I was going on and on and on. I mean, it was really kind of like, it wasn't real user testing, but it was enough to give me the feedback I needed to say, okay, this is something that was going to connect and resonate with people. And it was really about, yeah, we did leave a lot of stuff out. We did look for baby name trends. We looked for nickname trends. Like we looked for like, you know, what do people like call their loved ones, and like, you know, the habibis, the sweeties, the love kind of thing. We looked for swear words, of course.
Of course.
I mean, I think that was the first thing we did when Sebastian built his like password finder, was look up all the naughty words, like sixth graders in their dictionary. But yeah, so it was really about, okay, there was something so basically human behind what we had visualized and behind this data set, that really became just the most compelling thing to me. And yeah, we could have kept going on and on and on, but at what point, like, you have to find an end to it, and you have to say, you know what, this is the end and this is enough. And that was a hard decision. That was a hard line to make. But in the end, it felt like a really natural end when we sort of did the storyboard.
Do you feel that that's something that you especially bring to these kind of processes, Sabina, just in terms of your writing background? You inherently have that editorial skill to know when to stop. So maybe that gives you a fresh lens to say, right, tempting as it may be, here's where we have to call it.
Kill your darlings. Yeah. And so I think that was definitely a skill that was unique to sort of a lot of people at the infographics group. But it is a skill that you need. And like, I worked in daily news and I worked in journalism. And so I usually had to stop because I had a deadline and I had to get something in before it had to go to the print or go on air. But in this case, like, we did have more flexibility, but it did also help me sort of find out what makes a whole story, what makes a complete story. Like, I don't have to tell everything to have a finished story in the end. And there were so many different angles that we had thought were really interesting. Like, we did find passwords with emojis, and we thought about, what does this mean? Like, does this indicate like is this sort of a sign of how more people are going mobile with their internet usage? Because emoji keyboards are only accessible really conveniently through mobile. We looked and like all the other like years, kind of what we could find in those things. And but yeah, in the end, this felt complete. It felt whole, and it felt relevant to everybody, or to as many people as possible.
And I think there's something about as well the idea of digital pieces that don't have the spatial limits of print. It does create more temptation to keep going and going and going. And I guess there's part of this which is to judge at what point do you think your audience will stop being motivated to continue. So the temporal dimension of an audience scrolling through, I guess, gives you some clues. And I think that's fascinating, the idea that you might also almost test out your understanding of the analysis by presenting it to others. As ever, we don't really truly understand things until we can explain it to others. So that sense that you did almost did a little trial presentation to people in a room to see, right, these are the contents that are engaging with people that then we can sort of use as a template to apply back to the digital piece. That's fascinating. Another kind of editorial judgment I just wanted to ask about was regarding the cutoff that you applied to the kind of archetype heat map, which we'll talk about in a second, which was a minimum of 3 digits right the way through to 31. What was the rationale for that kind of cutoff framing choice?
If you look at the password length distribution chart, you see that at a certain amount of length, the percentage is just minuscule. So it doesn't make sense to go from there really. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to go from more than maybe 20 because you have the 99.999% of passwords are not longer than like 20 characters. So it was just like, we show that it technically goes on and they're technically longer passwords, but they don't say as much. The 6 to 10 character passwords are really the ones that you should focus on.
I like the idea that 31 characters is reasonable, and then it drops off to crazy world 32 onwards. Super. So we move on to the. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
One of the reasons for that specific number is that 32 is one of the first lengths where hashes are making the vast amount. So
right,
like when you make an MD5 hash and you get 32 characters, hex characters, and at that point it's hard to differ, and not all hashes are like recognizable as such, and so it would make sense to drop off after there, because the likelihood that the password wouldn't be a password but a hash or some data garbage would just accelerate from there on.
Great, yeah. So moving on to the design stage, and actually I think the first thing I want to talk about is the project title, which feels like it's been derived from the archetype that you've used. The heat maps are the method that you've chosen to represent the data. So we've got these kind of pyramids or triangular structures, as I've just mentioned, from 3 through to 31, and then we use that as a consistent archetype to then present the different findings. At what point did the heat map become the method, and what other charts did you consider? I'm thinking there's clearly behind the scenes probably been some histograms, there could be some network maps possibly, but what other methods did you consider, and when did you decide that the heat map was the way forward?
I mean, heat maps were presented as one of the initial sketches that Sebastian showed me when we first started talking about this. And I remember there was a Venn diagram that you tried to do. Oh yes. There were obviously like bar charts and things like that. But I don't know, the heat maps were for me so compelling. I mean, the first one and the eye chart. And I think the first one for me where I was like, what is happening here? It's when we looked at the special characters. Oh, there's, the special characters where you had the two streaks kind of going through at this parallel like line. And I was like, what is this? And it was the one where people were clearly using their email addresses as their passwords. And that it was so clearly illustrated. And I was like, okay, I think this is what we needed to do. And you also sort of mentioned the title heat score. So heat score is a word. So I'm from Saskatchewan in Canada. And heat score is kind of a word that we sort of used in the 90s when I was in high school, when we were kind of doing something that was slightly illegal. So like, or
Okay.
actually illegal. And so, and you could get like attention for your illegal behavior. So when we were kind of coming up with a headline, I was like, so there's this word from my youth that would actually be really perfect for it, because it is an illegal data set. We are doing it to get attention for our publication. And also sort of we're scoring passwords on a heat map, and it's a word that was done, and basically, yeah. And I knew it was a word that was kind of out there, and I was like, okay, this is a very obscure reference, but because it's an obscure reference, maybe it's also something that can kind of like have a new life in a new context. And I also learned that, a high school student, like I learned from my brother, who's 7 years younger than me, that by the time he was in high school, they were calling it heat bag. So I was like, okay, this is really obscure now.
Yeah, the cool kids have got a new way to express this thing now.
Yes, the cool kids of Saskatchewan, Canada.
Yeah, and obviously, so the heat map is the main repeated representation method, but the eye chart, as you've described it, which is I think a perfect description, is the first thing. So it's these different size letters used to show the frequency of each digit used, each character used. Again, was this the first thing that you landed on as an approach?
Pretty much. I mean, when it was the first thing I made, I was just looking at, I was counting characters and then putting out the numbers and thought, yeah, well, E is a very, very prominent character, so let's like size the characters in their percentage of appearance, and then it was like, wow, this looks like the thing you read at the optometrist. So, yeah. It's a bit sad because the optometrist uses uppercase characters, and of course lowercase characters are more popular in passwords, so it wasn't exactly the same thing. But yeah, the association was there, and this was I printed it out and put it on the wall, and like, so what do you think of that? And Sabine liked it.
And just on this chart, what was the cutoff for which characters made it into the chart and which were left out?
Oh, they're all there, but the less used ones are so small you can't actually see them.
Right. Okay. Nice idea. Yeah.
I think technically
technically
they're not really in there, but on the printout there were like single dot ink specs for all the less used special and uppercase characters. So.
Just going on to the heat map, just as a I guess a sort of design motif, then the heat map structure that you've used is sort of circular rather than perhaps the traditional sort of more grid-based square or rectangles. Was the sort of circle motif something that you kind of felt was a nice sort of binding, repeated approach? Because obviously you've got the pagination dots, you've got the navigation arrows, you've got the heat score, as you talked about, which is unveiled through this almost sort of decoding operation taking place. Was that something that felt like a thread to run through the whole piece?
I mean, that decision.
For me, it was just like I want to output it in a certain way, and a circle is really the easiest shape to draw, and we stuck with that. But I think Sabine has some thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely sort of pulled it through the other elements, especially with that title and things like that. Just thinking about what your password looks like when you enter it and it's like not revealed. So like usually when you enter your password, it's a line of circles. And so we really wanted to kind of, and like because Sebastian had already put the circles in the heat map, we wanted to stick with that kind of motif because it just felt right.
Yeah, I think it works completely well as well. Obviously, the as I've said, the repeated representations of this sort of stat pyramid of circles is used throughout. The colours are the things that change from one topic to the next. What was the rationale for the colours? I guess, like, for me personally, when it comes to making choices around colours, I can spend endless waste of time liking every combination and struggling to commit to one. So what was the rationale that you went through, and how did you make the final choice?
I don't know if there really was a rationale. We kind of wanted to give every set its own identity because we were working with the same form in every slide. We had to make sure that there was something that was clearly different from sort of topic to topic or theme to theme. So I think it was really just a matter of giving every marker, as it were, like its own identity. Also thinking about how people share, like on social, like these kinds of stories. We wanted to sort of make it something that people could screenshot, something that sort of like be shared and like still be able to be clearly readable, and sort of be able to give like clear identifiers as to the different things. So I don't know if there was really, maybe there was, we'll have to ask Kwame. But yeah, it was really more about going through different colors, creating a spectrum and giving everything its own identity.
And I guess the two most consistent coloured applications are the yellow for the highlight, some editorial emphasis, but also the black background. Is that, what was the, I mean, backgrounds are often a difficult thing, again, to commit to. Is that just a stylistic choice, or did you feel that black backgrounds, for example, work best for mobile visualizations and therefore that becomes the anchor point? What was the sort of thinking there?
Yes.
I agree.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think the fact that we were working with kind of this like dark and seedy data set, we want to sort of stick with that thematically. We do start with like a white background and kind of fade into the black. And when we come back out of the scrolly telling, we go back into a white. So I think it was more just about style, just what looks good, what could sort of pop the most. Yeah, what could stand out.
And I think it does, and I think black backgrounds do work especially well on mobiles. And I think, there's something. It's an elusive quality, but there's something cool about a black background and then sort of more saturated colours in the foreground, which I don't know why, but it does feel that it has that sort of that notion. I think it's also something that feels consistent with technology and that sort of tech topic that we are referring to.
It's a more nerdy thing. I mean, you have the classical terminal with the green letters on the black screen. It's the hacker stereotype, and it's like, we are diving now into the dark web. Ooh, look there. And now we're emerging from it unscathed, but with more knowledge. It's a good metaphor.
I was just thinking, we're in Berlin and we wear black here. I mean, I don't right now,
yes.
but
yeah. Normally you would,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I got dressed up for you.
Thank you very much.
You're
I appreciate it. Well, it's a special finale, so that's always appreciated. With regards to interactivity, the main interactive features are for navigation purposes. We've got the pagination dots, we've got the left, right, we've got the full screen view. Were you tempted? Sorry, we've also got at the end of the process the chance for you to enter your password, which we'll come on to in a second. Were you ever tempted to offer more interaction as we go through this story, to let people hover over things, for example, or to inquire about each topic that you are analysing?
Those were really sort of limitations set by the software that we were working with. This is not a hard-coded story. This is a story that's like almost like put together as like more as like an animation in some ways through the software that they use. And so its interactivity was just a step beyond what we could do with it, really. So, but in the end, it was okay. Like I felt like if we really wanted to sort of set out, your show is called Explore Explain. We really wanted to sort of do the explanation behind the data set and really kind of spoon feed almost people like what was happening and kind of go into it that way.
Yeah, I think perhaps that constraint that you mentioned, it can be helpful because, again, the temptation could be to say, right, at every juncture, right, folks, dive in and do some interrogation of this and hover over this. But having that constraint means that you have to, and you do take control over telling this story, which I think is a useful constraint to have. The annotations, in terms of the explanation features, like the titles, like the captions. So I guess, Sabina, this is something that you perhaps led on in terms of the commentaries. And again, what was the cutoff for how much explanation, commentary you felt each of these different views offered? What was the sweet spot between too little or too much?
We wanted to sort of introduce every subject, and they each got kind of like a vague name, like countdown or like upfront kind of thing, sort of that would sort of refer to what we were about to look at. And I think it was really about like, what are the two main things we need to look at? Like and it was just sort of about like creating something that was kind of just like snap, snap, like bang, bang, move on, and really look at what are the main takeaways? What are the key things? Like where is it concentrated? And really just kind of explaining that. And again, just sort of keeping it, like there was tons of obscure stuff in there that gets visualized, but it was really about kind of explaining the top level in order to keep it interesting, really, to a large number of people.
That's it. I think it helps with the pacing, as you say. If you've got a couple of things to say at each juncture, then you move on, two more again, then you move on. I think it helps with the pacing and the rhythm for the reader as much as it is for you as a storyteller in this context. The last question with regards to the sort of design choices is the composition, the layout, the sizing arrangements. What were the main factors that led you to, for example, give up the amount of space that we do see given to the heat map pyramid, and to the placement of the interactive navigation features? Was this again something that perhaps was led by what works on mobile, then just leads to whatever will translate to desktop?
Yeah, I mean, this is also sort of constraints that we were dealing with the presets of Info.Graphics and like the software that we were working with as well. Like the navigation buttons are standard in all the stories that we did for them. Like the little scrolly the dots that kind of go along the bottom. Those are all sort of things that are built into every story, and they're just there all the time. In terms of like sort of giving the space to the headlines and the words, that was because of what we were doing for mobile first, and then focusing on like what could, making sure it didn't look too awkward on desktop. And even still on some mobile devices, like I sometimes wish the captions were a little bit bigger. I think they could have been a bit more readable, but I'll take it.
And we spoke earlier about this final interactive feature, which is the chance for you to interrogate the database and to check on potentially your password or a password. Did you have any hesitations around this, about people fearing how you might use the data? I know you've got a caption to try and explain away concerns, but did it ever make you feel, let's leave that out, let's not go there?
Not as such. I was, of course, concerned what are the legal consequences. I mean, showing a visualization of an illegal data set is probably fine. Showing the illegal data set might be not fine, so we have to find the right balance between wanting to make this explorative, letting people explore the data, but also taking privacy concerns into consideration. And of course, I mean, it's basically an input field where you're supposed to enter a password, hopefully not your actual password. And rightly so, people would be concerned about this. I mean, this would be the stupidest password phishing approach ever. But so we took some technical precaution that no actual full password are transmitted. I mean, it's transmitting the first 3 letters you enter, and you get back a file with all the passwords that start with those 3 letters. Those are far better handleable in size by the browser than the whole thing. So there was a good compromise, I think. Except for, I think one thing was too many, and then I had to split it up with the first 4 characters. I think when it's 1, 2, 3, 4 or something. But in any case, so we tried to find the right balance, and I would be sure security researchers would see this thing and see how it's made, and then say, yeah, well, it's actually true what they're saying, and the code supports what they're claiming in the small print. So I didn't have a big concern about it. But of course, I mean, I'm a software developer, and our responsible people at the company might take it otherwise, so we asked them first, and they came to the conclusion that it's probably all right.
Absolutely. I think that last sentence, this is for entertainment and educational informational purposes only. That's the, just chill out, everyone. This is awful.
Yeah, this is just for fun, guys.
Exactly. Yeah, yes. Calm down. Excellent stuff. So just reflecting now on the overall production. So you spoke already, Sabina, about the tools. Can you just explain what tools were used for the production of this work?
I think so. Most of the graphics were already created in Illustrator, and then they were uploaded into the software that was used by info.graphics, and I think Sebastian can speak more to like the actual data wrangling tools and stuff like that.
Yeah, I didn't have one tool you can get off the shelf. I basically wrote all the software I used of my own, and I used techniques that are not very common. I mean, usually people just open a data set in a text editor and throw some regular expressions onto it. I couldn't do any of that because regular expressions take far too long when you have billions of records. So I had to stream the data, decompress it, and then do some binary operations on them to filter it out, which would be way faster, but it's a bit of a deeper dive in the usual data wrangling. Yeah, so there weren't very many tools. I used Node.js as a technology. I used some libraries for decompressing, but in the end of it, I wrote the software. I used my own on the go, and it's probably fit for no other purpose than working with this data set exactly.
Absolutely. And kind of reflecting now on the process, the project itself, did you enjoy working on this? Has it been something that you feel was an effective outcome? How has it gone down? What feedback have you had? How do you sort of reflect on the success of the project and also your own personal involvements and the enjoyment levels?
It was a very fun project. It was really like being the kid in the candy store, except instead of candy there is data, and I could grab everything and really work on it. So it was very pleasurable to work on it. It was, in the end, I was like, oh, I'm so over this data now because it was drawn out. And I mean, if you stare at the same sort of data for weeks on end, it stops being fun at some point. It's like the eating too much ice cream problem. But it was one of the favorite projects I ever did. And this was a unique opportunity to work on a large data set that hasn't been visualized in this depth as of yet. And yeah, and then working with all the colleagues to making the design, this was also very pleasant because then all the hard work and all the long hours I put into this now came to be this wonderful, beautiful thing that made sense and translated my very abstract data sets into something people could understand, and that was very satisfying in the end, yes. And in regards of feedback, I of course heard from some friends and colleagues and people who are in the same field than I am, some very positive feedback. And I think my favorite one was there is this security podcast, Risky Business. I sent a link to Patrick Gray and said, here, I made this thing. Would you take a look at it? And yeah, they were like, wow, this is a really cool tool. This is like a Google for passwords, and this really highlights the problem. And I was very pleased with that feedback, I can tell you.
Of course. Sabine?
Yeah, I loved working on this project. Like, it was really fun because I mean, it was just like, it felt like it was a really nice flow. I did have to fight for it on a couple like points, like just in terms of like getting other stakeholders, like getting the ownership and like getting the leadership kind of on board with it to sort of that we could kind of keep going with it, because it wasn't like necessarily about making money in this kind of thing and investing in that kind of time and pulling like the talents that we did onto it and having to justify that. But I think it was definitely worth it in the end on a personal level for sure. I mean, I loved working with Sebastian. Like, we had so much fun, like kind of exploring all the things and like putting in like all the swear words and sort of seeing what else we could do with it. And yeah, he had like so many great ideas that it was sort of fun to just kind of like ravel off and go on that.
Yes.
But for the most part, it was like, yeah, it was a great teamwork. It was really harmonious, and like there were some parts where it like got a bit drawn out, but I think that's part of the process. And in the end, when you look at the end result, like it's such a good story. The feedback has been really great. I mean, just in terms, I have presented it like beyond just Oslo and other places, and just the way people can identify, like, you know, we always tell people when they're data visualizers to sort of give people the opportunity to find themselves in the data. And that usually sort of draws directly to an element of interaction. And in this kind of thing, we've been able to do that where people can find themselves in the data and really sort of see the human aspect of what we were showing without having to do anything other than scroll down. So I think that for me is like just a huge success.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a fantastic piece of work. And I think it's only enriched my appreciation for it, listening to the process that you've gone through and the wrangling of the data, and I think above all else the editorial judgment to not go too deep into all these other potential avenues that you could have gone through. So I think that's only enriched my appreciation of it. I've already mentioned that I think it's a world-class example of mobile viz in and of itself alone. So I think it's a super solution. And and thank you both so much for sharing your insights into the behind-the-scenes story of this project, which is the last topic of Season 1 of Explore Explain. So thank you to all you out there listening and watching this season, and hopefully we'll be back soon with Season 2. Thank you and goodbye. To see more information about today's episode, including links to the key sites and resources mentioned, visit my website at visualizingdata.com. You'll also find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time. Explore Explain is a Matt Nods interactive production.